Isabella thought her marriage to Lawrence was solid, until she found the email from his colleague Sophie. Her old friend Arthur is back in her life, offering comfort as their relationship crumbles. But is Lawrence really hiding more than just late nights at work? Isabella watched the last slice of the sun disappear behind the horizon. The soft light of the twilight filtered through the curtain across the silent living room. Her wine glass, now halfway empty, trembled in her hands as she rethought the events of the day. Every interaction, every small sign that life had been unraveling quicker than she could get a grip on. Lawrence was late again. These last few months, it had become a pattern, an unsaid routine she had learned to expect. The clink of the clock echoed through the house, reminding her how alone she had felt. The words of her best friend Anne, who had popped over that afternoon, lingered in her head. "Isabella, is everything okay?" "You seem off lately," Anne had said, the concern etched across her face. "I'm fine," Isabella had lied, plastering a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just busy with work. You know how it is." Anne had looked at her for a long moment, her eyebrows knit in worry. "You know you can talk to me, right?" Isabella had nodded, but she hadn't spoken up. How could she? What would she even say? How could she explain that the life she had spent 15 years building with Lawrence felt like it was slowly crumbling, slipping through her fingers? How could she admit the man she thought she knew, the man she had loved so fiercely, had begun to feel like a stranger? She refilled her wine glass, hoping it would numb things somewhat, or at least dull the ache that had taken root in her chest. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter and yanked her from her reverie. She glanced over at Arthur. His name glowed softly on the screen, comforting in confusion. Arthur had come back into her life just when she needed him most. They had been childhood friends growing up in the same small town until life had taken them differently. When he moved back a few months ago, she had been surprised at how easily they had fallen back into their old rhythm, talking about everything and anything. Of late, though, the conversations had shifted. They had become more profound, more intimate, full of things unsaid. She hesitated before opening the message. "Thinking of let me know if you need to talk. I'm here." A lump formed in her throat. Arthur's concern was genuine, making her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. But Lawrence, he was her husband. He was her husband, her partner. She couldn't let her feelings for Arthur distract her from fixing what was wrong at home. But what was wrong? Lawrence had always been a dedicated man, hardworking and driven. But this summer, something shifted that she couldn't quite place. His absences grew longer, his excuses thinner, and then, of course, there had been Sophie. She had never been the snooping type. She valued trust in a relationship, and in their first 14 years together, Lawrence had never given her a reason to question this. But a few weeks ago, an email popped on the screen while updating his phone, catching her eye. The email was from Sophie, a co-worker at Lawrence's firm. It wasn't the words themselves that unsettled her. It was the tone. It was the tone. There was something in the way Sophie wrote to Lawrence that felt too personal, too familiar, and the way he had responded, teasing. It had felt wrong. Isabella had told herself she was reading too much into it and shouldn't jump to conclusions. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Now, as she sat in their quiet home, her fingers tardily reaching over the reply button to Arthur's message, she felt that seed sprouts into something darker, something more authentic. Then, suddenly, the creak of the front door sounded, and Lawrence stepped inside, his face touched by the cool evening air. He gave her a passing smile, the sort of distracted smile he had perfected lately, and hung up his coat. "Hey," he said as he entered the kitchen, his eyes barely meeting hers. "Sorry, I'm late. Work was crazy today." Isabella watched him closely, the wine glass cold against her fingers. "Work's always crazy these days," she said, calm but probing. Lawrence shrugged, busying himself with a bottle of water. "Yeah, we've got the new merger going through. It's been intense." She wanted to believe him. She tried to think that work was why he'd been so distant. The reason he hadn't touched her, really touched her, in weeks. But the gnawing feeling in her gut told her there was something more. "I was thinking," Isabella said, with soft but measured tones, "perhaps we could go away for a weekend. Just us two. It's been a while since we spent time together, just us." Lawrence paused, the bottle of water midway to his lips. "I don't know, Isabella. I don't know if I can get away right now. Things are crazy busy here at the firm, and Sophie's team is helping with the merger." There it was again, Sophie. That name sent a cold shiver running down her spine. Isabella made herself smile. "Sure. Perhaps sometime else." The words were shallow and hollow, without the ring of intimacy of how it used to be. She watched him head upstairs, his steps heavy and slow, leaving her again in the quiet of the evening. The following day, Isabella woke up at an unearthly hour. Her mind was still entangled in the previous night's happenings. Lawrence was already gone. His aftershave faintly lingered in the air. She sat in bed, feeling a strange mixture of anger and sorrow. Her life had turned into unfinished conversations and unheard questions. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Arthur. "Coffee today. No obligation. I thought you could use a break." Mute. Isabella stared at the message, her heart pounding. Arthur had been supportive since they had reconnected, but lately she had felt something shift between them. His concern had deepened, his words taking on a tenderness different from friendship. She did not want to lead him on, but could not deny how comforting having him in her life had been. She responded, then faltered for a moment before she could type out her response. "Sure, I could use a break. See you at the cafe in an hour?" The cafe was small and cozy, just off the main street. The comforting smell of freshly brewed coffee and soft conversation humming greeted Isabella. Immediately, she spotted Arthur, who sat at a corner table, his back to the window scanning the crowd. When his eyes found her, they lit up, and he immediately rose to greet her with a warm hug. "You look beautiful," he said softly and honestly. Isabella smiled, even as she felt a pang of guilt at his words. "It's good to see you." They sat down, and for a while, the conversation was light about old memories from their childhood. But Isabella could feel the weight of what she wasn't saying pressing down on her. After a few minutes of silence, she finally spoke. "Arthur, I don't know what I am doing," she whispered. Arthur cast forward, his eyes full of concern. "What do you mean?" Isabella looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting the napkin on the table. Lawrence were growing apart. "I think he's hiding something from me. I don't know if it's work or something else." Her voice caught with the last word, and she felt the prick of tears in her eyes. Arthur leaned across the table and took her hand in his soft touch, firm. "I'm so sorry, Isabella. I had no idea things were that bad." She shook her head. "Neither did I. Not until recently." She hesitated, then added, "There's this woman at his firm, Sophie. I found an email, and I can't stop thinking about it. I have been always with her lately. Always with her lately, always mentioning her. I do not know what to think." Arthur's jaw clenched, eyes darkening in anger. "Have you talked to him about this?" She nodded. I tried, but he just brushes it off. Says it's work, that I'm imagining things. But it doesn't feel right, Arthur. It doesn't feel right at all. Arthur gently squeezed her hand. You deserve to know the truth, Isabella. You don't have to live like this. His words were comforting, yet a shiver traced down her spine. She knew he was right. She couldn't go on acting like everything was fine when, quite obviously, it wasn't. The thought of confronting Lawrence terrified her. What if her worst fears were genuine? Before she could say anything in reply, her phone buzzed once more. She looked down at the screen. It was Lawrence. Lawrence. Running a late meeting tonight. Don't bother waiting up. Isabella stared at the message, a ball beginning to form in the pit of her stomach. Another excuse. Another night alone. She turned back to Arthur then, her heart heavy with the weight of a decision she knew she needed to make. I think I need to talk to him, she said then. The voice steady, firm with resolution. I need to know the truth. Arthur nodded, though there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that was disappointment in a pouch. If you need anything, be sure I'm here. Now, Isabella smiled weakly, grateful for his support, but she also knew she trod dangerous grounds. Arthur's presence in her life had just stopped being as spiritual as his original intention and, though comforting, terrified her. She couldn't afford to blur the lines. Not now. Not when her marriage hung by threads. That evening, Lawrence arrived home later than usual, his tie undone and his face riddled with weariness. Isabella had been waiting in his house for him, simply sitting on the sofa, her fingers grasping a cup of tea that had gone cold some time ago. Lawrence, she began as he stepped through the door, we need to talk. He glanced at her, surprised by the firmness in her tone. What is it? Isabella rose, her heart in her chest, while Lawrence's expression closed off. I want the truth. About Sophie. About where you've been these past few weeks. I've tried being patient, Lawrence, but I cannot keep faking that everything is all right. Isabella, I have told you before that Sophie is simply a colleague. Nothing is going on. Then why do you always bring her up? Why are you always around her? I saw the emails, Lawrence. Her voice cracked, the weight of her words hanging in the air. For a moment, Lawrence said nothing. He looked at her, his face unreadable. Then he let out a sigh and rubbed his temples as if the very act of the conversation was exhausting him. It's complicated, Isabella. I've been going through something. Work has been insane, and Sophie's just someone I can talk to. Someone you can talk to. Isabella's voice had a keen edge, and anger began to bubble over. I'm your wife, Lawrence. You're supposed to talk to me. I know, but it's not that simple. With every passing second, Isabella felt her heart break a little more. The gap between them had increased so much that she didn't know how to close it anymore. I can't do this anymore, Lawrence, she whispered softly. I can't keep living in such a manner where my brain is in doubt every other moment, questioning whether you are telling me the truth, whether you're still in this marriage. Lawrence looked at her, his eyes filled with something that looked like regret, yet resignation. I don't know what to say, Isabella. I didn't want this to happen, but it did, she finished for him, her voice barely above a whisper. They stood there, the silence between them deafening. In that instant, Isabella knew something fundamentally had shifted. Whether he had cheated or not, it almost didn't matter anymore. Months of distance and unspoken truths had shattered their trust. "I think we need some time apart," she said, the words tasting bitter in her mouth, yet somehow right at the same time. Lawrence did not argue. He merely nodded, his face a mask as if he had anticipated it all along. The next several days slid by in a fog of numbness and routine. Isabella packed a small suitcase and left to stay with Anne for a few nights. Needing space to think and to breathe, she and Lawrence barely spoke, speaking with each other only about practical matters. Who would feed the cat when she would come by to pick up more clothes? The finality weighed heavy upon her heart, yet she knew there was no going back. Arthur called multiple times and offered support, but she kept her distance. She needed to work through her emotions and figure out what she wanted. Arthur was comforting, but not the answer to the more profound questions she needed to ask herself. While sitting in Anne's guest room one evening, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was Arthur. "I miss you. Can we talk?" Her heart clenched as she knew he considered her more than a friend. All that was hard to work out for her. In the present scenario, as the situation seemed too raw and unsolved. "I need some time, still being prepared." The response came in instantly. "I understand. Take all the time you need." Isabella stared at the screen, her heart heavy with everything unsaid. She put the phone down and curled up on the bed, and for the first time since she had left Lawrence, tears brimmed over and cascaded down. The summer drug on, blistering and suffocating, as Isabella battled to find her footing again. She moved briefly back into the house while Lawrence stayed with a friend, but every room felt like a reminder of what she'd lost. Eventually, she told Lawrence she couldn't stay in the house because it held too many ghosts of their life together. One afternoon, Lawrence unexpectedly appeared while she was packing up the last of her things. He stood in the doorway, fidgeting, not knowing what to say. "Isabella," he began, his voice soft, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." She looked up at him, her heart aching with mixed emotions. "Lawrence, I don't know if sorry is enough." "I know," he said, the regret dripping from his eyes. "I never wanted any of this to happen. I don't even know where we went wrong." Isabella exhaled, a load of what felt like years of resentment and hurt settling into her chest. "We stopped talking, Lawrence. We stopped being honest with each other, and we forgot how to love each other somewhere along the way." Lawrence nodded, and his face reflected the same sadness as hers. "I wish I could fix it." "I do, too," Isabella whispered. They stood there momentarily, people who had once deeply loved each other, standing on opposite sides of a chasm, too vast to cross. At that moment, Isabella realized that the marriage she'd fought so hard to save was already over. "I hope you find what you're looking for," she said softly and picked up her suitcase. Lawrence didn't stop her. He didn't try to convince her to stay. He just watched her go, his face etched with the understanding that some things were too broken to be fixed. Weeks passed, and months slowly crept up on Isabella as she began rebuilding her life. She found a small apartment in the city, immersed herself in work, and sought therapy to process the grief of a failed marriage. Arthur remained constant in her life, though she kept him at arm's length for a time, not wanting to complicate things until she healed. Arthur took her on a walk in the park one crisp autumn morning. The trees were ablaze with hues, and the air was fresh and cool. They had been meandering down the path for some time until, finally, Arthur spoke up. "Isabella," he started carefully, "I've been waiting for you. But the one thing I'm dying to know is, do you see a future for us, or am I just waiting for something that won't happen?" Isabella stopped in her steps, her heart pounding as she turned to Arthur, who had supported her in ways Lawrence never had. Yet she also knew rushing into something new would not erase the pain of what she had lost. "I care about you, Arthur," she said, "but I'm still healing. I don't want to hurt you by jumping into something before I'm ready." Arthur nodded, eyes soft. "I understand. I'll wait as long as you need." They continued walking, the silence comfortable yet uncertain of what may come. As Isabella looked up at the vibrant colors of autumn leaves, she realized that for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of what the future held. She stood at the park's edge, the cool breeze blowing her hair out behind her, and looked over the city below. She was still determining where life would take her next, whether she would rebuild with Arthur or continue on her own for a while longer. But for the first time, that uncertainty didn't scare her. She had learned that sometimes, despite how hard one tried to hold on to them, some things would always slip away. At other times, letting go was the only way to heal completely.